The child's screams tore through the private jet cabin like a living wound, visceral and unending. Every soul aboard felt it, the way sound can become physical torture, boring into the skull, twisting in the chest. But not a single person moved. Not the two bodyguards with shoulders like steel beams. Not the silver-haired woman clutching rosary beads near the galley. Not the three men in expensive suits who sat stone-faced, pretending the agony of a 3-year-old didn't exist. Because the child belonged to Silas Vesper. And you didn't approach Silas Vesper's son without permission. Silas sat in the leather captain's chair, his navy suit wrinkled for the first time in his adult life. The fabric bunched awkwardly around his shoulders where Dante twisted and thrashed against him. His tattooed hands that had ended men with surgical precision, trembled as they tried to position the child more comfortably. Tried and failed. Dante's legs hung useless, the light blue outfit doing nothing to hide how still they remained while the rest of his small body convulsed with anguish. 3 years old and already broken by a world that had meant to break his father. "Sir." Matteo appeared at his elbow, voice low and urgent. "We could divert to Denver. Get the boy to—" "No." The word came out strangled, lacking its usual edge of absolute authority. "We stay on course." But Dante didn't care about courses or schedules or the reputation of the man who held him. He only knew pain, the phantom agony of legs that no longer obeyed him, the terror of the explosion that still played behind his eyelids, the absence of the mother who used to make everything stop hurting. His screams climbed higher, a pitch that suggested something breaking inside. Silas had tried everything. The stuffed wolf from Dante's bedroom. The bottle of warmed milk that now soaked into his suit jacket. The songs he barely remembered from his own childhood, sung in hoarse Italian that caught in his throat. Nothing penetrated the wall of his son's suffering. For the first time in 20 years, Silas Vesper felt the thing he'd spent his life avoiding, powerlessness. Raw and complete and suffocating. 3 rows behind, Naira Solari felt her body respond before her mind caught up. Her fingers flexed involuntarily, muscle memory from 12 years of reaching for the dying, the suffering, the ones everyone else had given up on. She closed her eyes, trying to force down the instinct that had gotten her into trouble more times than she could count. Not your problem. You're just the help. Serve drinks, keep your head down, disappear when you land. She'd been grateful for this job, last-minute contract work paying 3 times her usual rate, no questions asked. She needed the money. Needed to disappear. Marcus was getting too close, and she had exactly $300 and a duffel bag between her and sleeping in her car again. The screaming escalated, and Naira felt phantom pressure in her palms, the remembered weight of fragile bodies she'd soothed through their final hours. Her grandmother's voice echoed, "Daso Moja, you have healing hands. God doesn't give that gift to make you hide it." "Ma'am?" The bodyguard nearest to her row, a man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, was watching her. "You need something?" Naira looked at him, then passed him to where Silas Vesper held his son. She saw what the others couldn't. The exact angle of the child's spine that suggested nerve pain, the way his tiny fingers clutched at his father's shirt in a pattern she recognized. Tactile seeking behavior. Trauma response. Her hands were already gripping the armrests, already preparing to stand. "That child," she heard herself say, voice steadier than she felt. "He's not just crying." The bodyguard's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, I need you to stay seated." But Silas had heard her. His head turned, those cold blue eyes finding her across the cabin. For a moment they locked gazes, the monster and the woman who couldn't stop reaching toward suffering. She saw the calculation in his stare, the weighing of threat versus hope. Then Dante screamed again, a sound like tearing metal, and something in Silas's face cracked. Naira stood. The bodyguard moved to block her, hand instinctively going to his concealed weapon. But she kept her hands visible, palms open, the universal gesture of harmlessness she'd learned in hospice when approaching frightened families. "I'm a hospice aide," she said, loud enough for Silas to hear over his son's cries. 12 years. I've worked with pediatric trauma cases." The lie came easy, close enough to truth. "Please. Let me try something different." The cabin fell silent except for Dante's ragged sobs. Every person aboard turned to watch. The silver-haired woman, Silas's grandmother, Naira would learn later, leaned forward, sharp eyes assessing. Silas stared at Naira for 3 heartbeats. She could see him calculating odds, measuring risks, warring with the desperation that made powerful men do dangerous things. Then he shifted Dante in his arms, an invitation. Naira walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body. The bodyguard stepped aside but stayed close, hands still hovering near his weapon. She reached Silas's seat and knelt, bringing herself level with the child. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, not reaching for him yet. "Hey, beautiful boy. I know. I know it hurts." Dante's eyes, red-rimmed and wet, found hers. For a fraction of a second, the screaming hitched. Naira turned to Silas. Up close, he was more dangerous than she'd realized. Violence lived in the set of his shoulders, in the white-knuckle grip on his son, in the hollowness behind his eyes. But underneath, raw as an open wound, was pure terror. "I need you to trust me," she said. "Just for 5 minutes." "Why should I?" His voice was razors wrapped in silk. "Because nothing else is working." She held his gaze. "And because I'm the only person on this plane brave enough, or stupid enough, to try." Something flickered in his expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite respect. But close. He held out his son. Naira took Dante into her arms, and the moment the child's weight settled against her chest, something ancient activated in her nervous system. She stood carefully, cradling him close, and began to move. Not rocking, that came later. First, just swaying, the same rhythm as a heartbeat. The same rhythm mothers had used since the first human baby cried. She walked toward the rear of the cabin, away from the watching eyes, and began to hum. Not a lullaby. Something older. The song her grandmother had sung in the old language, the one that spoke to something deeper than words. Her free hand found the base of Dante's skull, fingers pressing gently on the pressure points her grandmother had taught her. Ancient knowledge passed down through women who healed before there were hospitals, before there were men in white coats telling them what was possible. Dante's screams began to fracture. Became hiccuping sobs. Then whimpers. Naira kept humming, kept swaying, kept applying gentle pressure. She found the tension points along his spine, the places where trauma lived in the body as surely as in the mind. She whispered to him in English and Russian and the wordless language of comfort. 3 minutes later, Dante went quiet. For minutes later, his breathing evened out. At 5 minutes, he was asleep against her shoulder, tiny fist curled into her white blouse. Naira turned back to find the entire cabin staring at her in stunned silence. The silver-haired woman had tears streaming down her face, crossing herself repeatedly. Silas had risen from his seat, frozen 3 feet away, looking at his sleeping son like he was witnessing resurrection. The old woman spoke first, rapid Italian that Naira didn't understand. But the tone was unmistakable: reverence, fear. Silas moved closer, each step careful, as if afraid to break whatever spell Naira had cast. When he reached her, he didn't take his son back immediately. Instead, he studied her face with an intensity that made her want to step back. "What did you do?" His voice was barely audible. Vagal nerve stimulation. Pressure point therapy. An old lullaby. She shifted Dante slightly. "And listening." He just needed someone to listen. "My grandmother," Silas said slowly, glancing at the old woman who was now speaking urgently to Matteo, "says you're touched by Santa Rita, the patron saint of impossible causes." He paused. "She says anyone who heals family blood owes us a life debt. And we owe them sacred protection." Naira's stomach dropped. "I don't want." "Doesn't matter what you want." But his voice wasn't cruel. Just factual. "You just became very valuable to very dangerous people. Starting with me." He finally took Dante from her arms, the transfer gentle and practiced. The child didn't wake, just settled against his father's chest with a soft sigh. Silas looked down at his son, then back at Naira. "What's your name?" "Naira. Naira Solari." "Well, Naira Solari." He gestured to the empty seat beside his. "Sit down. We need to talk about your new job." "I already have a job." "This flight is." "Not anymore." He sat, cradling Dante with one arm while pulling out his phone with the other. "Matteo, we're going to need a contract drawn up. Full-time position. Pediatric specialist." He looked at Naira. "You have medical training?" "Hospice aide. Certified. But I'm not." "Close enough." He was already typing. 3 times your current salary. Room and board at the estate. Full medical benefits." "I can't." "You can." His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw past the monster to the father underneath. "Because in the last 5 minutes, you gave me something I haven't had since the day my son's legs stopped working. You gave me hope." He paused. "And I protect what's mine, Miss Solari. You just became mine." The plane continued its journey east. Behind them, the sun was setting over the Rockies, painting the clouds in shades of blood and gold. Naira sat in the leather seat, hands shaking in her lap, and realized with crystal clarity that she'd just made a choice that would either save her or destroy her. Probably both. Across the aisle, the old woman caught her eye and smiled, a knowing, ancient expression that suggested she'd seen this story play out before. In her weathered hands, the rosary beads clicked softly, marking time or prayers or perhaps counting the threads of fate being woven together at 37,000 feet. Santa Rita, the old woman whispered, so softly only Naira could hear. She always chooses the broken ones to work her miracles. Naira looked at the sleeping child, at the dangerous man who held him, at the life she'd just stepped into without meaning to. Broken ones, she thought. Yeah, that sounds about right. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, but the silence in the cabin felt fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Dante slept against Silas's chest, his breathing finally even, but every person aboard watched with the tense awareness of prey animals sensing a predator's mood shift. Naira remained in the seat beside Silas, hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. She could feel Nana Rosa's eyes on her from across the aisle, assessing, measuring, seeing things Naira didn't understand yet. Silas spoke without looking at her, his voice barely above a whisper. How long will he sleep? An hour, maybe 2. Naira studied the child's face, relaxed for the first time since she'd seen him. But when he wakes, the pain will come back. What I did was temporary relief, not healing. Then you'll do it again. Not a question. It's not that simple. His body needs. I don't care about simple. Silas finally turned to her, and up close, his eyes were more devastating than dangerous. Bloodshot. Haunted. I care about my son not screaming himself unconscious. I care about him sleeping through one goddamn night. His jaw worked. Can you give me that? Naira should have said no. Should have explained the limits of pressure point therapy, the need for proper medical intervention, the fact that she wasn't qualified for whatever he was asking. Instead, she found herself nodding. I can try. Nana Rosa chose that moment to rise from her seat, moving with the deliberate grace of the very old who've learned to make every motion count. She crossed the aisle and stood before Naira, dark eyes sharp despite the web of wrinkles surrounding them. When she spoke, it was rapid Italian directed at Silas, but her gaze never left Naira's face. Silas responded in the same language, his tone edged with impatience. The old woman cut him off with a sharp gesture, then switched to accented English clearly meant for Naira to hear. You have il taco benedetto. The blessed touch. She reached out and took Naira's right hand, turning it palm up. Her thumb traced the lines there with surprising gentleness. Your Nana taught you the old ways, yes? Before she passed. Naira's throat tightened. How did you? I know the look of a girl raised by grandmothers. Nana Rosa smiled, sad and knowing. We teach things the world forgets. Things that save lives when nothing else can. She released Naira's hand and turned to Silas. She healed your blood. Sang della tua sang. You know what this means. Nana. It means debito di vita. The old woman's voice carried the weight of immutable law. Life debt. The old bond. She saves the child suffering, we owe her protection. This is la leg sacra. Even you cannot break it. Silas's expression darkened. This isn't Sicily. We don't. We are Vesper. Nana Rosa straightened, suddenly imperious despite her small stature. The old laws live in our blood whether we honor them or not. This girl touched your son and took away his pain. Santa Rita herself guides her hands. She made the sign of the cross. You will protect her as family. And she will stay with the boy until he no longer needs her. The cabin had gone utterly silent. Even Matteo, standing near the cockpit door, looked uncomfortable. Naira realized with creeping horror that she was witnessing something rare, someone giving Silas Vesper orders he couldn't refuse. I have a life, she heard herself say. I can't just. Nana Rosa turned back to her, and the look in her eyes was neither unkind nor yielding. What life, Bambina? The one where you run from a man who put bruises under your clothes? The one where you sleep in your car because you have no home? The old woman's expression softened. I am old. I see what others miss. You need protection as much as my Nipotino needs healing. God puts broken pieces together for a reason. Naira felt the blood drain from her face. She hadn't told anyone about Marcus. About the bruises. About sleeping in her car between jobs. How could you possibly? Because I was you once. Nana Rosa's smile turned wistful. A long time ago, in a different country, running from a different kind of monster. And a man with dangerous hands offered me safety I didn't think I deserved. She glanced at Silas. His grandfather. My husband. God rest him. Silas closed his eyes briefly, something complicated passing across his features. When he opened them again, he looked at Naira with an expression she couldn't quite read, resignation mixed with something else. Something that might have been relief. 2 weeks, he said finally. Trial period. You stay at the estate, work with Dante, and if my grandmother is right, if you can actually help him, we'll discuss something permanent. He paused. Triple your current salary. Private room. Full security detail. And the man who's been calling your old apartment looking for you? He gets a visit from my people explaining why you're no longer available. Naira's pulse hammered in her ears. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, a beautiful cage disguised as sanctuary. But another part of her, the part that had been running for 6 months, sleeping in parking lots, jumping at every shadow, whispered something different. What if this is the only way you survive? She looked at Dante, still sleeping peacefully against his father's chest. Thought about the moment his screams had stopped, the weight of his small body finally relaxed in her arms. Thought about her grandmother's voice. Daso Moja, God doesn't waste gifts. When you can heal, you must. Okay, she whispered. 2 weeks. Nana Rosa's smile was triumphant. Silas's was grimmer, the expression of a man who just acquired something valuable and dangerous in equal measure. Neither of them saw Mateo's face, tight with concern, as he pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to someone on the ground. Boss just brought a civilian into the compound. Unknown background. Security risk. Advise. The plane continued east, carrying them all toward a future that none of them, except perhaps Nana Rosa, could have predicted. Outside the windows, the last light bled from the sky, and darkness settled over the land like a promise or a threat. In his sleep, Dante's fingers curled tighter into his father's shirt, and for the first time in weeks he didn't whimper. The private airstrip sat in the darkness like a wound in the earth, a single ribbon of illuminated concrete carved into Pennsylvania woodland. The jet's wheels kissed asphalt at precisely 11:47 p.m., and before the engines had fully spooled down, 3 black SUVs materialized from the shadows, their headlights cutting through the night like predator eyes. Naira watched through the window as armed men emerged from the vehicles, moving with the fluid efficiency of those accustomed to violence. Her stomach twisted. She'd agreed to 2 weeks, but the reality of what that meant was crystallizing with every passing second. Silas stood, cradling Dante against his shoulder with practiced care. The child hadn't stirred during landing, still held in whatever peace Naira's touch had granted him. Nana Rosa gathered her things with unhurried dignity while Mateo appeared at the jet's door, his scarred face unreadable in the cabin's dim lighting. We need to talk, Mateo said quietly, his eyes flicking to Naira. Before we leave. Silas handed Dante to his grandmother, a transfer that made the old woman's face soften despite the late hour, and followed his underboss down the jet stairs. Naira watched them through the window, 2 silhouettes in expensive suits standing just beyond the splash of light from the cabin. Mateo's body language was tense, gesturing sharply. Silas stood perfectly still, the way apex predators do before they strike. Their voices rose just enough for fragments to drift back through the open door. Civilian, for Christ's sake. My grandmother invoked debito di vita. Romanos are already sniffing around after the botanical garden incident. My son, my decision? Mateo threw up his hands in a gesture of angry surrender and stalked toward the lead SUV. Silas remained on the tarmac for a long moment, head bowed, one hand pressed to the back of his neck. Then he straightened, rolled his shoulders, and became the monster again. When he climbed back into the jet, his face was a mask of cold authority. Miss Solari. His voice carried no trace of the desperation she'd heard earlier. A word. Naira's legs felt disconnected from her body as she stood. She was acutely aware of the single duffel bag at her feet, everything she owned condensed into 40 pounds of fabric and regret. $317 in her wallet. No family to call. No place to return to that Marcus hadn't already poisoned. She followed Silas to the front of the cabin, away from where Nana Rosa hummed softly to Dante. Up close, she could see the exhaustion carved into Silas's face, the shadow of stubble darkening his jaw, the way his expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the scent of his son's spit up on his shoulder. My underboss thinks I'm making a mistake, he said without preamble. He's probably right. We don't bring outsiders into the compound. Ever. It's a security risk that could get people killed. His eyes found hers. But my grandmother believes in old traditions and I believe in keeping my son alive and sane. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to be certain of your answer. He pulled a folded paper from his inner jacket pocket, a contract, she realized, already prepared. Someone had typed it up during the flight. 2 weeks as Dante's primary caregiver. You'll live in the estate, have access to whatever resources you need for his care, and receive $75,000 upon completion of the trial period. He paused. In exchange, you sign an NDA that would bankrupt you if violated, you submit to a background check that will uncover every secret you think you've buried, and you accept that leaving before the 2 weeks are complete isn't an option. Once you're inside, you're inside. Naira's mouth went dry. $75,000. More money than she'd made in 2 years of work. Enough to disappear properly, to start over somewhere Marcus would never find her. What happens after 2 weeks? She heard herself ask. If Dante's improving, we negotiate something longer term. If he's not. Silas's expression hardened. You leave with your money and a legally binding agreement to never speak about what you've seen. My people will relocate you somewhere safe. New city, new identity if necessary. And if I say no right now? Something flickered in his eyes, not quite respect, not quite disappointment. Then you walk off this plane and I make sure your ex-boyfriend gets a visit that encourages him to forget you exist. Consider it payment for the peace you gave my son tonight. No strings attached. It was a test, Naira realized. He was giving her an exit, offering her the protection his grandmother had declared sacred without demanding anything in return. She could walk away clean, start over with that gift, and never enter this dangerous world. She looked past him to where Dante slept against Nana Rosa's chest, his small face finally peaceful. Thought about the way his screams had torn through her, the instinct that had made her stand when everyone else remained frozen. Her grandmother's voice echoed, "When you can heal, you must." "I need a pen," Naira said quietly. Silas produced one from his pocket, and she signed her name on the contract with hands that trembled only slightly. When she handed it back, he studied her signature for a long moment. "Welcome to the Vesper estate, Miss Solari." He folded the contract and returned it to his jacket. "I hope you don't regret this." "I already do," she thought but didn't say. The drive through the Pennsylvania countryside felt like descending into a fairy tale written by someone who understood that all old stories are really about survival. Trees pressed close to the narrow road, their branches forming a tunnel that swallowed the SUV's headlights. Naira sat in the back seat beside Dante's car seat, watching his sleeping face in the glow of the dashboard lights. Silas drove with one hand, the other resting on the gear shift, his attention divided between the road and the rearview mirror where he could see his son. Nana Rosa rode in the second vehicle with Mateo. The third SUV followed at a discreet distance, carrying men whose faces Naira hadn't seen. "We're 10 minutes out," Silas said, the first words he'd spoken since they'd left the airstrip. "The estate sits on 40 acres. Walls on 3 sides, the river on the 4th. There are cameras, motion sensors, and men who don't sleep. You'll have freedom within the grounds, but you don't leave without permission and escort." "Am I a guest or a prisoner?" The question slipped out before Naira could stop it. Silas glanced at her in the mirror. "That depends entirely on whether you give me a reason to choose." The gates appeared suddenly, iron monsters 15 feet tall, crowned with decorative spikes that weren't decorative at all. They swung open silently, and the SUV rolled through onto a cobblestone drive that curved through manicured gardens. Then the house revealed itself and Naira's breath caught despite everything. It wasn't a mansion. It was a fortress pretending to be one. Stone walls rose 3 stories, dotted with windows that reflected the security lights like watchful eyes. Classical architecture merged with modern security, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard water flowing. The river, she realized. The 4th wall that couldn't be breached with ladders or force. "Home," Silas said, and the word sounded like a warning. The room was a cage dressed in silk and lies. Naira stood in the doorway, taking in the 4-poster bed with its cream-colored linens, the antique dresser that probably cost more than her car, the original oil painting on the wall, some Renaissance Madonna with knowing eyes. A door on the left led to a bathroom of white marble and gold fixtures, bigger than the entire studio apartment she'd fled 6 months ago. On the right, another door stood ajar, revealing the soft glow of a nightlight and the corner of a crib. Dante's nursery. She was being positioned as close as possible to the child, as if proximity alone could guarantee his peace. "The windows are reinforced," said the woman who'd escorted her upstairs. Lucia, she'd introduced herself, though her tone suggested the name was a formality rather than an invitation to friendship. Mid-30s, dark hair pulled into a severe bun, movements precise as a surgeon's. Or a soldier's. "They don't open." Security protocol. Naira crossed to the nearest window and tested it anyway. Sealed shut as promised. Outside, the estate's grounds stretched into darkness, dotted with subtle security lights that turned the manicured gardens into a chessboard of shadow and exposure. She could see the dark ribbon of the river in the distance, moonlight catching its surface like scattered diamonds. Beautiful. Trap. Both things at once. Breakfast is at 7 in the staff dining room, Lucia continued, her accent faintly European, Israeli maybe, or somewhere in that region. You'll meet the rest of the household then. Mr. Vesper has requested Dante's medical files be brought to you within the hour. Is there anything else you need tonight? My freedom, Naira said, not turning from the window. Pause. Then, that's not on the menu, Miss Solari. When Lucia left, the lock clicked softly. Not loud enough to be threatening. Just loud enough to be heard. Naira sat on the edge of the bed, too soft, too expensive, too much like something she'd lose, and pressed her palms against her eyes. The weight of the day crashed over her. The plane, Dante's screams, the contract signed in desperation, the fortress gates closing behind them. She traded one cage for another, except this one came with silk sheets and armed guards and a broken child who needed her. Her duffel bag sat by the closet, a ridiculous splash of poverty against all this wealth. $317. A change of clothes. A photograph of her grandmother she'd salvaged from the apartment before Marcus could destroy it. Everything that mattered, everything that was hers, condensed into 40 pounds. A soft knock interrupted her spiral. The door to the nursery opened and Nana Rosa appeared, moving with that careful grace of the elderly who've learned to navigate darkness. She carried a thick manila folder. The medical files, the old woman said, setting them on the dresser. Every doctor's report, every specialist's note, every test result since the accident. Her dark eyes found Naira's. You should read them tonight. Before you see the boy in the morning light. Why? Naira stood. What am I going to find? Nana Rosa's expression shifted into something ancient and sad. The truth about what my great-grandson has survived. And why every person in this house looks at him like he's already a ghost. She crossed herself. That child has seen things no 3-year-old should carry. His legs don't work because his heart broke first. She left before Naira could respond, pulling the nursery door closed behind her with a soft click. Naira waited until the sound of footsteps faded, then opened the folder. The first page was a hospital admission form, dated 7 months ago. St. Sebastian's Medical Center. Emergency admission. Multiple trauma. The clinical language couldn't hide the horror. 3rd-degree burns on the lower extremities, smoke inhalation, complete paralysis below L1 vertebrae, severe psychological trauma. Attached, a police report. A car bombing in the parking garage of an upscale restaurant. 1 fatality, Alessandra Moretti Vesper, age 29. 1 survivor, Dante Vesper, age 2 years 8 months. The next pages were worse. Psychiatric evaluations that documented a child who'd stopped speaking for 3 months. Who screamed when anyone touched his legs. Who had night terrors so severe he'd given himself nosebleeds. Who drew pictures in therapy that were nothing but flames and a woman's face disappearing into red and orange. He watched his mother burn. Naira's hands shook as she turned the pages. MRI results showing no structural damage to the spine. The paralysis was incomplete, possibly psychogenic, the neurologist had noted. With intensive physical therapy and trauma counseling, there was a 40% chance of regaining function. But Dante had refused every therapist. Screamed at every doctor. Rejected every attempt at help until he'd exhausted the patience of every specialist in 3 states. The final page was a handwritten note clipped to the back, the script elegant and furious. This child is beyond our help. His trauma is too severe, his resistance too absolute. I recommend long-term psychiatric institutionalization before he harms himself or others. He will not recover in a home environment, especially not one as complicated as the Vesper household. Dr. Helena Reeves, child psychologist. Below it, in different handwriting, masculine, aggressive, find me someone who won't give up. SV. Naira closed the folder and pressed it against her chest, breathing through the wave of grief that threatened to pull her under. She'd known Dante was traumatized. But this was a child whose soul had been shattered, whose body had frozen itself in grief, whose mind had decided that if he couldn't save his mother, he didn't deserve to walk. A sound from the nursery made her freeze. Whimpering. Soft at first, then rising. She was through the connecting door before conscious thought caught up. The nursery was painted in soft grays and whites, expensive and sterile, as if someone had let an interior designer loose without understanding that children need warmth, not aesthetics. Dante lay in his crib, thrashing against his blankets, tiny face contorted in dream terror. Naira crossed the room and laid her hand gently on his chest, feeling his hummingbird heartbeat through the thin pajama fabric. She began to hum, the same lullaby from the plane, the one her grandmother had taught her when she was barely older than Dante. His whimpering subsided. His breathing evened out. But his eyes opened, luminous in the dark, and locked on her face with an intensity that stole her breath. "Mama," he whispered. Naira's heart cracked cleanly down the middle. "No, sweetheart. I'm Naira. Remember? From the plane?" His lower lip trembled. "Mama's gone." "I know, baby. I know." She was on fire. His voice was matter-of-fact in the way of children who've repeated a truth so many times it's lost its power to hurt them. "I couldn't reach her." Naira sat on the edge of the crib, careful not to jostle his legs. "That wasn't your fault. You were so small and so brave." "My legs don't work anymore." He looked down at them, expression distant. "Daddy says they will. But they won't. They stopped when Mama stopped." There it was. The connection his neurologist had missed, the truth his psychiatrist had failed to excavate. Dante's paralysis wasn't just trauma. It was loyalty, punishment, penance. His mother had stopped moving in the flames, so his legs stopped moving too. "What if," Naira said slowly, "your legs could work again? Would you want that?" Dante's eyes filled with tears. "Mama can't come back." "No, she can't. And that's the worst thing in the world." Naira touched his small hand. "But you're still here. And she loved you. Do you think she'd want your legs to stay broken?" He considered this with the terrible seriousness of a child forced to think like an adult. "She used to say I would run so fast. Faster than Daddy." "Then maybe," Naira whispered, "you could learn to run again. Not to forget her. But to remember how much she loved watching you move." Dante stared at her for a long moment. Then he closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost missed it. "Would you help me?" "Yes." The word came out fierce, certain. "I promise." She stayed with him until his breathing deepened into real sleep, then returned to her room and sat at the small desk by the window. She pulled out a notepad from her bag and began to write, a treatment plan that broke every conventional rule, that combined modern trauma therapy with her grandmother's old-world healing, that would require resources and freedom and trust that no one in this house had any reason to give her. By the time dawn broke over the Pennsylvania hills, she had a list of demands that would either save Dante or get her thrown out of the Vesper estate by noon. She chose noon. The staff dining room fell silent when she entered. 6 people sat around a long wooden table. A cook, 2 housekeepers, a groundskeeper, Lucia, and a man who looked like Matteo's younger, meaner brother. All of them stared at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "The miracle worker," the cook said, her voice dripping acid. "We've heard about you." Naira took the empty seat at the far end. "Just a hospice aide who got lucky." "Lucky?" Lucia's laugh was sharp. "Is that what we're calling it?" Before Naira could respond, the younger version of Matteo leaned forward. "You know why no one's talking to you? Because the last woman who got close to the Vesper family ended up burning to death in a parking garage. And we're all wondering which one of us is next." The cook shot him a warning look. "Marco." "What?" "She should know what she's walked into." Marco's eyes were hard. "This house is cursed. Anyone who loves Silas Vesper dies screaming." Naira met his gaze steadily. "Good thing I don't love him then." "You will." Lucia's voice was quiet. "Everyone does, eventually. That's the real curse." The moment stretched, taut and uncomfortable, until Naira stood, her untouched breakfast cooling on the plate. "I need to see Silas." "Where's his office?" "3rd floor," Lucia said. "West wing. But he's in a meeting with his captains and he doesn't like to be." Naira was already walking. She found the office by following the sound of raised voices. The door was heavy oak, closed but not locked. Through it, she could hear multiple men arguing in rapid Italian, Silas's voice cutting through occasionally with surgical precision. She knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for permission. 4 men and Silas himself turned to stare at her. The room reeked of expensive cigars and the kind of testosterone that came from men who'd killed and gotten away with it. Silas sat behind a massive desk, his suit jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing the full sleeve of tattoos on his left arm. Matteo stood by the window, looking like he'd been in mid-rant. The other 3 men, all older, all dangerous, occupied the leather chairs opposite Silas. "Miss Solari." Silas's voice could have cut glass. We're in the middle of... I need to talk to you about Dante. Naira stepped fully into the room, ignoring the way every man's hand shifted slightly toward concealed weapons. Now. Mateo looked like he might have a stroke. You can't just... It's fine. Silas raised a hand and the room fell silent. He studied Naira with those cold blue eyes, and she forced herself not to flinch. Gentlemen, give us the room. Boss, one of the older men protested, we're not done discussing the Romano situation. I said, give us the room. They filed out, Mateo last, closing the door with a pointed click that suggested this conversation would be thoroughly reported later. Silas waited until their footsteps faded, then gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Sit. I'd rather stand. His eyebrow rose. Would you? Naira pulled the folded treatment plan from her pocket and set it on his desk. I read Dante's medical files. All of them. Including the recommendation that he be institutionalized. Something dangerous flashed in Silas's expression. That will never happen. I know. Because I'm going to help him. She leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. But I can't do it locked in a room like a prisoner. I need access to the grounds for outdoor therapy sessions. I need the ability to order specialized equipment, sensory integration tools, adaptive mobility aids, art therapy supplies, without running every purchase through 3 levels of approval. And I need to be able to contact my own trauma counselor for consultation. Silas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. You read a file and now you're an expert? No. But I talked to your son at 4 a.m, and he told me he thinks he deserves to be paralyzed because his mother died. The words came out harder than she'd intended. So unless you have another specialist lined up who actually gives a damn about the child instead of the paycheck, I suggest you listen. The silence stretched. Silas's expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the white-knuckle grip on the arms of his chair. 2 out of 3, he finally said. You get grounds access with Lucia as your shadow. You get a procurement card with a reasonable monthly limit. But no phone calls. Not until I know who you really are, Miss Solari. Not until I'm certain you're not working for someone who'd use that access to hurt my family. I'm not. Everyone says that. He stood, and suddenly the desk between them felt insufficient. But I've been in this life long enough to know that desperation makes people do unthinkable things. And you, Miss Solari, came onto that plane desperate enough to approach a man like me. So until I'm satisfied you're exactly who you claim to be, just a woman running from a bad situation, you stay in my cage. Comfortable. Protected. But locked. Naira wanted to argue. To insist that she was harmless, that he could trust her, that she had nothing to hide. But the truth was more complicated and they both knew it. She'd signed her name to a contract she barely read. Entered a world she didn't understand. Promised to heal a child she wasn't qualified to treat. And somewhere in the back of her mind a small voice whispered, what if he's right not to trust you? Fine, she said quietly. 2 out of 3. Good. Silas came around the desk, stopping close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something dark and expensive that probably cost more than her monthly rent used to. Now get out of my office and go help my son. That's what I'm paying you for. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. Miss Solari? That thing you did on the plane, the lullaby, the pressure points, whatever magic you worked, my son slept through the night for the first time in 7 months. So despite your complete lack of respect for protocol. He paused. Thank you. Naira looked back at him, this man who killed for a living, who built empires on fear, who just thanked her with something that almost sounded like sincerity. You're welcome, she said. But I didn't do it for you. His smile was razor thin. I know. That's why I'm letting you stay. Naira found him at 2 a.m., a shadow in the nursery's darkness. Silas sat in the rocking chair beside Dante's crib, still wearing his dress shirt and slacks from the meeting, sleeves rolled up, tie discarded somewhere. He didn't look up when she entered, his attention fixed on his sleeping son with an intensity that bordered on desperate. He used to sleep in our bed, Silas said quietly, voice stripped of its usual authority. After the nightmare started, Alessandra would put him between us and he'd finally stop shaking. His jaw worked. Now he screams if I hold him too long. Naira stayed by the door, uncertain. You're here every night? Every night I'm home. He finally looked at her, and in the dim glow of the nightlight, she saw the exhaustion carved into his features. The bombing was meant for me. Romano Syndicate. They knew my schedule, knew I'd be at that restaurant. His hands gripped the chair arms. Alessandra took Dante to surprise me. If she'd stayed home. Don't? Naira stepped closer despite every instinct screaming retreat. You can't live in the if. Can't I? Bitterness crept into his voice. My son can't walk because I chose this life. Because I made enemies who'd burn a woman alive to send me a message. The silence stretched between them, heavy with grief. Naira found herself reaching out, her hand settling on his shoulder. The contact jolted through them both, electric, dangerous, too intimate for what they were. Silas stood abruptly, dislodging her touch. The walls slammed back, the monster reasserting itself over the broken father. Don't mistake my gratitude for safety, Miss Solari. I'm not a man you should trust. Naira held his gaze, refusing to retreat. I don't trust you. But your son does. And that's enough for now. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. Before he could respond, movement in the doorway caught both their attention. Matteo stood there, face tight with concern, watching them with the expression of a man witnessing a catastrophe in slow motion. Boss, he said carefully. We have a problem.